Chapter 1. Personal Responsibility versus Personal Irresponsibility. I can solve a problem only when I say, "This is my problem, and it's up to me to solve it." M. Scott Peck. Personal Responsibility and Healthy Power. A number of influential great authors have written about the pivotal role personal responsibility plays in mature power development. Stephen Covey introduced the first of his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People as learning to be responsibly proactive instead of being emotionally reactive, attributing blame for the latter, responsibility, to people and/or things outside oneself. Similarly, Deepak Chopra emphasized in his 7 Spiritual Laws of Success the critical value of becoming self-referred versus object-referred. He recognized that a sense of personal responsibility sets the stage for self-empowerment, while defining or otherwise allowing ourselves to be driven by outside forces is a pathway toward individual hollowness and eventual failure. Accordingly, the first root principle in this book's powerful framework stems from the following premise regarding personal responsibility. Power equals responsibility. Power and responsibility develop in direct proportion to each other and are functionally related within healthy individuals and systems. We see a direct relationship between power, control, and responsibility, accountability, since the more power we possess, the more responsibility we bear for how we use it. Further, the relationship between power and responsibility is a functional one, since when you increase one side of the equation, you get a proportional increase on the other side and vice versa. The caveat is that we're talking about a reasonably healthy individual operating within a comparably favorable situation. Accordingly, if we are mature, well-developed people working within a predominantly healthy family or societal system, we will become more powerful in healthy ways as we handle our duties more responsibly. Our willingness to take complete ownership of and control for our choices propels us down the path to self-empowerment within any healthy system. Conversely, such a person predictably becomes so much more responsible that she becomes appropriately self-empowered and develops in a supportive environment. It follows, then, that the fundamental way to help someone who has an adequate sense of conscience to become even more responsible in both personal and professional settings is to empower that person, grant her increased authority, provide instruction, training, supports, and tools, and then hold her reasonably accountable. This is the fundamental nature of good parenting within families, and, likewise, it is also the essence of good management in work settings because they share the common goal of promoting successful growth and development that mutually benefit the individual and the system in which she functions. This process unfolds and becomes clear when we consider how a candidate in training at a police academy responds when first given a loaded handgun for target practice. Suppose you are that candidate. If you are mature, you will recognize immediately that you are holding deadly force in your grasp, increasing dramatically your potential power to destroy lives, including your own, as well as property. Rather than acting carelessly or dangerously, as a scrupulous person, you will adhere closely to safety instructions regarding appropriate weapons discharge and usage, etc., showing your heightened sense of responsibility. As such a police officer who thinks beyond the training, you will likely be promoted because you demonstrate increasing levels and forms of responsible behavior in the performance of your duties. Within any healthy system, responsible behavior is eventually rewarded with increased authority, since employers generally compensate people for their responsible and valuable performance. People are not usually rewarded or promoted for their authority. Instead, employees gain higher authority and other forms of empowerment to enable them to better meet their responsibilities. The empowerment lesson here is this: if you want to become more powerful within any reasonably healthy system, then act more responsibly. Not only does this root principle apply to the fairly commonplace situations of parenting children and managing staff, it also has profoundly important relevance to situations where we are pressed to extremes of hardship by suffering trauma and loss. In his analysis of those men who found inner strength to survive the horrors of concentration camp life versus those who became broken and often died, Viktor Frankl reported the following account of the relationship between personal accountability and energy for living. Quote, "The typical reply with which a man rejected all encouraging arguments was, 'I have nothing to expect from life anymore.' What sort of answer can one give to that? What was really needed was a fundamental change in our attitude toward life. We had to learn ourselves, and furthermore, we had to teach the despairing men that it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life, and instead to think of ourselves as those who are being questioned by life daily and hourly. Our answer must consist not in talk and meditation, but in right action and in right conduct." Unquote. Man's Search for Meaning, 1959, page 85. Throughout my career, and especially during the past 10 years, understanding the dynamic relationship between power and responsibility has served me as a useful diagnostic formula when evaluating people seeking resolution from their strife. For example, I find it illuminating to ask someone during the interview process about her handling of current and/or previous difficult, challenging situations, personal and/or professional in nature. There is a striking and important distinction between those who report having been able to overcome and solve problems and those who point the finger of blame, make excuses for failures, and present their victim role in such responses. Since power and responsibility always travel together in a healthy, mature, competent individual, such persons are likely to report a sense of ownership, responsibility, when having faced earlier problems. Whether or not they solved the problems, they describe their experiences from the perspective of an internal locus of control and, therefore, with a strong sense of accountability for how they handled them. Among truly great, effective leaders, I've found a consistent relationship between the responsibility they demonstrate and how well they are empowered. This reflects an encouraging interplay of individual behavior and team dynamics, and it has been well described by Jim Collins, Good to Great, 2001, Chapter 2. Level 5 leaders embody humility with resolve, demonstrated in part through the window and the mirror, looking unselfishly through the window to give full credit to staff when things are going well, while looking courageously in the mirror to take responsibility when things are going poorly. It's no surprise that he also found ineffective leaders tended to do the opposite, thereby generating tension and resentment as fallout, compromising their effectiveness. The bottom line is this: you hold the trump card of personal power, since no one can make you do anything against your will as long as you are willing to be fully responsible for your choices, including the consequences that your choices could bring upon you. This also means that there is absolutely nothing that you must do in this lifetime. There is a trite phrase that asserts, "The only things you have to do in life are to die and pay taxes," a popular but misleading notion, since it assumes that you have no choice. While inevitably each of us will one day die, whether by natural causes or tragically, there is absolutely no one who can make you pay taxes. Of course, since there is always a cause and effect relationship, failure to pay your taxes is a high-risk decision for which most people do not roll the dice. However, as we all know, there are many people who do withhold payment, proving the point once again that each of us holds the final authority and exercises final control over our action. accordingly. Each of us is responsible for the choices we make and is rightly held accountable for how we wield our power. Once you become clear about your personal empowerment in actual and consistent practice, not merely as an exercise in semantics, then and only then will you become totally free. Any prudent person will weigh the probable risks against potential rewards of their choices before committing to taking action. Therefore, for example, most people pay their taxes rather than gamble with adverse consequences and otherwise to uphold their civic duty. The point emphasized here, however, is that once you perceive yourself as controlled by forces outside of yourself, you not only have someone or something to blame for your actions, you also have abdicated your power in making a shift from an internal to an external locus of control. Remember the principle that power and responsibility go hand in hand. Thus we know, at least unconsciously, that our reduced power equally relieves us of responsibility. This also calls to mind the process through which too many of us subvert our inherent potential power by avoiding or denying responsibility, which brings our discussion about pathways to power eventually to the other side of this same coin. In the following poignant yet uplifting passage, Viktor Frankl provides us with his account of the universal truth regarding our freedom to make choices at life's most challenging forks in the road, therein reaffirming our responsibility to choose our own path under any circumstances. Quote, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Seen from this point of view, the mental reactions of the inmates of the concentration camp must seem more to us than the mere expression of certain physical and sociological conditions. Even though conditions such as lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various mental stresses may suggest that the inmates were bound to react in certain ways, in the final analysis, it became clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision and not the result of camp influences alone. Fundamentally, therefore, any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him mentally and spiritually." Unquote. Man's Search for Meaning, 1959, page 75. There are tremendous positive ripple effects interpersonally from growing into personal responsibility as part of one's character and behavior. First, since we tend to trust individuals who hold themselves accountable as their personal code of conduct, risk-taking naturally increases between people so connected. This, of course, is a critical component of intimacy in all of its forms, for without trust, we tend to keep a safe distance in order to protect against perceived risk. Second, since any leader acquires the power to be effective primarily from those being led, we will enjoy greater empowerment via our people as we win their loyalty and support through consistently responsible use of our authority, as in the servant leadership description offered earlier. Finally, consistent demonstration of responsible behavior with appropriate accountability inspires others to follow such an example, especially when it is made clear that such is the formula for healthy self-empowerment. Power equals responsibility. Personal irresponsibility and unhealthy power. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the task which it constantly sets for each individual. Viktor Frankl. At the opposing fork in the road is the pathway toward personal irresponsibility. One obvious way to recognize that we are not leading our life responsibly is when we blame others for the things we are doing. When we go in this direction, whether consciously or otherwise, we progressively deny culpability for our struggles or failing while attributing responsibility to others and/or forces outside of ourselves. The problems we manifest this way often result from clinging to tenaciously to our perceived power while shirking and shedding responsibility for bringing painful consequences or otherwise not meeting our own or others' expectations. Mature people understand that blaming others for our action is an invalid stance to take, since no one ever controls our minds unless we permit it, and because it is from our own minds that we choose one path or another. Some have argued that's wrong because sometimes people make other people do bad things by holding weapons against them, so they are not responsible when they do those bad things. Although that might sound convincing, the truth remains that the final choice always rests with the person with the gun to her head, as long as she is willing to accept the consequences of her decision. Many great heroes from history have chosen torture, imprisonment, and even death, rather than be compelled to do something against their inner beliefs and values. They realized unequivocally that they were responsible for their final choice and did not blame others for the choice that they made, no matter how terrible the outcome might have been. They called forth and demonstrated their ultimate freedom to choose, expressing their ultimate power by doing so. Frankly, the desire to wield power without accountability or other negative consequences represents a fundamentally primitive attempt to have the best of both worlds, at least from the standpoint of childlike wishes and fantasies born out of magical thinking. Such a desire, while perhaps initially and superficially attractive, refutes the logic of cause and effect relationships. Whenever we make things happen through our choices, we are appropriately responsible for the outcomes we generate through such choices. As Stephen Covey would say of any such universal law governing the human race, this constitutes a true north principle. From a developmental and psychological standpoint, any person's quest for unhealthy power stems from the normally egocentric, the world revolves around me, grandiose, I am superior, and omnipotent, I am all-powerful features that are so recognizable among 2-year-old toddlers. Instead of taking responsible ownership for her well-being and better self-control by making adjustments, the egocentric individual at any age is continually in search of external, in lieu of internal, solutions to relieve her from personal distress. Accordingly, she demonstrates little or no intrinsic motivation to change from the inside out. Similarly, her adjustment muscles remain underdeveloped, or, if they have already grown, they atrophy through underuse during circumstances in which she is permitted to behave irresponsibly. Empowering unhealthy expressions of primitive, immature, and rebellious behavior by not setting appropriate limits and enforcing fair, consistent consequences only serve to prolong a person's experiences of omnipotence through undisciplined expansion. Figuratively, it allows the genie to escape from the bottle and then to wreak havoc without regard for the feelings or welfare of others. After all, this individual has not been required to adjust her self-image from being the center of the universe to being one of the billions of people who occupy our planet. She clings instinctively to a grandiose sense of self and fails to develop humility, the latter being the cornerstone of reality-based personal social adjustment, which will be covered more fully in Chapter 5. As described earlier, emotional maturation proceeds only through commensurate adjustment. Therefore, the child or adult who enjoys power without motivation to change via meaningful consequences will predictably remain developmentally arrested. Because enabling such behavior engenders maladjustment, whether in rearing children or in responding to those in authority over us, this aspect of unhealthy power is usually a prominent feature of relatively unhealthy families and other systems, power without commensurate responsibility. Of course, it is equally damaging to the psyche of a maturing individual to crush her spirit through overly controlling, domineering, or otherwise abusive treatment, whether within family life for the developing child or for us as adults within the context of our relationship to our supervisor or an oppressive partner at home. Just as it interferes with healthy emotional maturation for someone to enjoy power disproportionate to their accountability, thereby enabling continued physical growth over time without age-appropriate personality advancement, it stifles the maturation process to endure the distress, especially the trauma of disempowerment born out of toxic exposure to unhealthy power. Tragically, this too often occurs when someone is held harshly and unfairly responsible by another while not having sufficient power to change or escape the situation. For example, a woman who is physically and/or emotionally abused within a domestic violence trap she is unable to escape soon learns to identify with her aggressor and internalizes a self-image in which it is safer to believe she deserves her cruel treatment than to oppose her oppressor. In such identification, as a defense against further abuse, she also learns to take responsibility for issues and problems she did not create, such as the misery of her abusive partner and/or the failings of her incompetent and controlling boss. What often results, especially during early childhood, but certainly also well beyond, is a compromised sense of self-esteem, a distorted sense of self and personal identity, and gaping hole in the fulfillment of the emotional needs that, if met, enable her to mature further. Instead, she is compelled to form a hard shell around her vulnerable core, having been damaged so through abuse and disempowerment. Unchanged, this rigid and strong external defense impedes her from moving ahead year after year. Should she fail to heal her wounds and make gains toward healthier maturity, especially in relation to others, she will predictably avoid intimacy to shield her vulnerable core from further injury and/or unleash her suppressed anger toward others who represent vulnerable safe targets. As a mother, choosing anger often results in child abuse, which perpetuates the generational cycle. As I said at the outset of this book, unhealthy power always leaves a destructive wake, even when the suffering lies hidden beneath the surface. Studies of prisoners of war who are tortured and brainwashed, for example, reveal an insidious phenomenon in which initially normal soldiers break down psychologically and become over-identified with their torturers as an unconsciously discovered mechanism for survival. Reportedly, it is common in such cases that the POW will later suffer extreme guilt and depression for having been so broken. However, it is also logical to assume that a large part of such self-loathing is at least partially the product of brainwashing, in which the prisoner eventually became convinced that she was responsible for the torture she was forced to endure as her just punishment, therein having identified with the aggressor in what is sometimes described as either the Stockholm or Patty Hearst syndrome. As these poignant POW accounts and similar all too commonplace reports of child and adult abuses so clearly show, the greater the gap between our power and our responsibility, the more pathological will be the resultant impact that we suffer. Recognize that the operating system of dictators, tyrants, and other dysfunctional individuals is one in which they wield authority while holding others accountable, especially for their problems and/or failure. Thus, unhealthy power is sought, at least unwittingly, through personal irresponsibility, and its arising logically manifests in dysfunction. Features of such dysfunctional individuals typically include the following: clinging to power while shirking and/or shifting responsibility for our actions, externalizing blame for pain, suffering, and/or failures, therein feeling like a victim, unwittingly abdicating our power to people and forces outside of ourselves, using our framework of perceived suffering, imposed failure, and unfair victimization as leverage points to gain support, sympathy, and attention. Secondary gain. Failing to adjust and grow because the focus remains fixed externally upon people and/or problems deemed to be needing change. I'm not the problem. My pain will stop when Susan changes her behavior and stops annoying me. Striving continually within large systems to be the tail that wags the dog in counterproductive fashion, thereby dishonoring and undermining reasonable systems of authority, instead of being self-empowered by learning to change our behavior and/or adjust. The pathway to personal responsibility. a metaphor for self-direction, the wind and the weather vane. Let us consider that a weather vane and the wind that directs it symbolize leadership choices that you might make and the ensuing responsibility. A weather vane typically sits atop a barn and has a horizontal structure with a flat piece of metal shaped like a rooster, an arrow, a horse, etc. This piece has a hole at the bottom used for mounting it on a rod that points vertically toward the sky. A fixed compass also sits at its base to tell us the direction the wind is blowing. As the wind blows against its broad surface, the weather vane spins until it points in the same direction as the wind, where it offers the least amount of resistance. There it will stay until the wind changes direction again, forcing the weather vane to take a new position. In this process, you can see that the weather vane has no control over the direction it points. If it had a mind like ours and was asked, "Which way are you going tomorrow?" it would probably say, "I have no idea. It's not up to me." If it was asked how it felt during a storm, it would probably say, "I'm spinning out of control, waiting for the wind to stop swirling me around." It's likely that you recognize the ideas represented by the weather vane and the wind as personal power and responsibility. First, you cannot enjoy the sense of peace or security that comes from control over your own life when you are a living weather vane, being driven from outside forces and turning at the will of the wind. Second, you must choose to be the wind so that you can set your own direction. Remember that the wind is free, not affixed to a rooftop, and because it influences change, it embodies power, energy, and the deliberate generation of movement. Third, it's important to understand that if you are not choosing your own direction, you are following someone else's direction. Once you have chosen your own path, you are acting as a leader, even if it turns out to be the same path you have followed unconsciously until that point. The difference is that once you make the choice, you become an active and responsible leader rather than a passive, disempowered follower. Now you might ask, if I'm supposed to be a leader and not a follower, what am I supposed to do when someone in authority, such as my employer or professor, tells me what to do? The answer in principle is actually quite simple, but not often achieved. A great leader always takes responsibility for the choices that she makes, whether it is to obey an order, rule, law, or to break it. The key to this is remembering what was described earlier here about power, control, and responsibility, accountability. You have ultimate control over the choices that you make. Therefore, you are free to the extent that you take responsibility for your decisions and actions. Therefore, if you choose to obey an order, you do well to own your decision completely, rather than saying you had no choice in the matter or someone made you do something against your will. This, of course, represents a clear departure from the defense verbalized irresponsibly by many of the Nazi war criminals following the atrocities identified in the Holocaust during the 1945 Nuremberg trials. Quote, "I'm a soldier. I was just taking orders," unquote. Becoming the driver of your life. Here are some helpful ways to take more responsible control of your life, using metaphoric references to driving cars for amplification. 1. The driver of the car takes active control while the passenger only goes along for the ride. 2. The person who develops good brakes learns how to stop, to slow down, and to avoid accidents along life's highways. 3. The person who learns how to steer discovers many more choices than the person who tends to move straight ahead without turning. 4. A flexible person learns to shift gears in order to move forward more quickly. 5. The ability to travel in reverse is just as important as driving forward, especially when you find out that you've been going down the wrong road. 6. The sooner that you accept that you've made a wrong turn and are lost, the sooner that you'll get back on the right track. 7. The person who gets where she wants to go in life is not the one who thinks she knows all the right directions. It's the one who is humble and respectful enough to stop and to ask for directions. 8. The freedom to drive your life is kept without interruption until you make a bad choice that leads to a fine or loss of license. 9. The person who enjoys the greatest freedom on the road is the one who is most careful to obey the traffic laws because, in the long run, she will still be driving when someone else who breaks the rules is not. 10. Winners show respect and courtesy by sharing the road with others and by thinking of others as winners too, rather than being a winner by making others lose. 11. Since what you focus on tends to expand and your car goes Where your eyes go, Garth Stein, The Art of Racing in the Rain, 2008. Keep your eyes on the road rather than letting anything distract you from your destination. 12. Take good and regular care of your car, and it will serve you well daily. Casting yourself as the director of your life movie. People usually say that a Hollywood movie, based on their favorite book, was not as good as the book, primarily because the visualizations that one creates when reading come from our personal tastes, desires, and fantasies. No director could ever match your best depiction of the characters, action scenes, etc. Similarly, no one else can unilaterally make suggestions for your goals and strategies for change that are personally matched with your unique innermost needs and desires. Therefore, cast yourself as the director to create and implement action steps toward your own life plan, emphasizing your unique ability to create your best possible movie. Action-oriented questions for developing personal responsibility. From Do One Thing Different, Bill O'Hanlon, 1999. What kinds of things would I like to accomplish or have happen in my future? What dreams did I or do I have for my life? What kinds of things will I be doing when I have resolved this problem? What, in my view, stops me from realizing my visions or getting to my goals? What am I afraid of? What do I believe must happen before I can realize my visions and goals? Is this really true? Or is it just an idea that I or someone else has? What are the actions that I haven't taken to make my dreams and visions come true? What are the real barriers that I'll need to deal with to realize my dreams and visions? What would my role models, mentors, or people I admire do if they were me in order to realize this dream or vision? Healthy Power, Prescriptions for Developing Personal Responsibility as a Leader in the Workplace. Number 1, walk the power equals responsibility talk. Speak frequently about this dynamic when explaining the rationale for your decisions and actions. For example, because of the consistent manner in which Jan has made effective choices, exercised her power, to succeed at project, I recommend her for this promotion with expanded duties, responsibilities. Conversely, the same principle applies when communicating about negative performance or behavior. Jane, you are being terminated, being held accountable, as the result of your choice to belittle your supervisor to a vendor after being warned repeatedly and in writing that the next infraction of this sort would result in your loss of employment here. Number 2, ask and answer these self-diagnostic questions, including input from trusted staff and peers where feasible. A. Am I an accountable servant leader, humbly striving to serve a mission greater than myself? Or do I impress others as being primarily concerned about my own welfare and prosperity, using my positional authority in self-serving or arrogant ways that could demean, frustrate, or hurt others? B. Do I demonstrate a democratic leadership style in which others feel empowered, valued, appreciated, and encouraged to find and express their voice? Or do I show more of a dictatorial approach, unilateral decision-making, double-standard behavior, controlling others without holding myself equally or more accountable for my actions? C. When I become frustrated, anxious, irritable, and tired, do I take responsibility for my reactions to others, graciously trying to become part of the solution? Or do I focus upon others and expect them to change or adjust in order for them to improve my moods and feeling states? 3. Clarify the performance expectations you have for your staff because, in general, all conflicts are the result of two or more people not sharing the same expectations. You will have fewer such conflicts with your staff and, when necessary, the disciplinary actions through which you hold people accountable will be logically determined by having first empowered them with clear expectations for their performance. Pearls of Healthy Power. Holly Lyle. Actions have consequences. First rule of life. And the second rule is this: you are the only one responsible for your own actions. Erica Young. Take your life in your own hands and what happens? A terrible thing. No one to blame. Diane Ackerman. I don't want to be a passenger in my own life. Seneca. We should every night call ourselves to an account. What infirmity have I mastered today? What passions opposed? What temptation resisted? What virtue acquired? Our vices will abort of themselves if they be brought every day to the shrift. calls for personal responsibility from politicians and social reformers. The full extent of healthy power within the domain of personal responsibility involves a commitment to being wholly responsible for our own health, safety, happiness, and well-being, independent of external circumstances or conditions. This is a tall order, thus to do so would make such a person exceptional, living and working in the 99th percentile, statistically abnormal in the most admirable way. Echoing the words of former presidents of the United States from both sides of the aisle during their efforts to rally the citizenry toward positive growth and change, imploring them to do what they deemed to be responsibly right rather than what was merely popular, we recall the following. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, January 20th, 1961. I have asked the Cabinet and my staff a question, and now I put the same question to all of you. If not us, who? And if not now, when? Ronald Reagan's second inaugural address, January 21, 1985. And finally, Walt Kelly, in his poster for the first Earth Day in 1972, issued a call to action through his iconic cartoon character Pogo, who stands amidst the trash and debris of a polluted forest scene, holding the populace accountable for the preservation of our environment in declaring, "We have met the enemy, and he is us."